If you enjoy watching my videos, please consider subscribing to my Patreon. Take a look at this map of the world. Its colors represent a measure known as economic complexity. This is a metric that represents the economic competencies of a given country given the goods that they export. Those countries which export goods that require less specialized skill or technology appear darker on the map, while those that produce goods which require a wider array of skill and technology appear lighter. This is a map that holds few surprises for any student of global inequality. The highest economic complexity countries tend towards the global north, while the lowest complexity countries tend to be placed in the global south. This map is one representation of a vast technological gap which exists between the north and the south. A gap which has a long history and association with imperialism. A gap which has tremendous consequences, especially in times of crisis.
A highway in Wuhan before the outbreak, and this is what it looks like now.
Tonight, U.S. cases of coronavirus more than doubling.
The sheer numbers of people succumbing to the coronavirus is overwhelming every hospital in northern Italy.
No health crisis in recent memory has had more of an impact on our collective psyche than the COVID-19 pandemic. In a matter of months, a novel coronavirus went from a localized outbreak in Wuhan, China, to infecting millions of people across the world. Soon the virus was triggering lockdowns in all major countries. It was a once-in-a-lifetime crisis that ground society to a halt. But then, a breakthrough. The American pharmaceutical company Pfizer and the German company BioNTech announced that they had developed a vaccine for the plague. It was approved by the World Health Organization for emergency use in December 2020. By April 2021, 4 more vaccines had been approved for emergency use. These vaccines and the others that followed represent the cutting edge of human technology. They could allow humanity the ability to inoculate itself against novel viruses and prevent the deaths of countless millions of people. These vaccines were furthermore the result of billions of dollars worth of public funding. The NIH Moderna vaccine alone received more than $2.5 billion in funding from Operation Warp Speed, a US government initiative to hasten vaccine development during the pandemic. You can see how much the other COVID vaccines received on the graph on screen. This does not capture the full extent of public support given to the various manufacturers of vaccines. Moderna's vaccine, for example, was developed in conjunction with the National Institute of Health, an organ of the US government. The AstraZeneca vaccine was actually invented by Oxford. Furthermore, the spike protein research, which was carried out by the National Institute of Health with public funding, was the basis for the Pfizer, Novavax, Johnson & Johnson, and Moderna vaccines. Despite the enormous amount of public funds dedicated to researching and producing these vaccines, they were in the end legally owned by private pharmaceutical corporations. At this key moment, in the midst of a global crisis, these firms held a collective monopoly on the rights to this life-saving technology. A monopoly which allowed these pharmaceutical corporations control over the production of desperately needed vaccines. The map on screen shows the geographical location of companies who received voluntary licensing agreements to produce their vaccines. It's easy to see that the vast majority of production is situated within the global north. Of course, one might argue that this is the case specifically because there is greater technological capacity in the north. But even so, it is a fact that there were massive amounts of unused capacity in the south. In fact, 2 researchers from Access IBSA and Doctors Without Borders compiled a list of 120 qualified manufacturers in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. 119, or more than 99%, received no contracts to produce mRNA vaccines. That is to say, the most advanced vaccines with the highest efficacy were underproduced. By limiting the supply on vaccines, these pharmaceutical giants negotiated from a position of strength with the various governments seeking to purchase them, driving up the price. The limited supply, combined with the great disparities in wealth between world nations, resulted in most of these advanced vaccines being purchased and hoarded by the global north. Because of this, in September of 2021, while most of the global north had vaccination rates higher than 50%, great swaths of the global south had barely received any vaccination at all. If we look at the same map a year later, though the situation had improved, there were still clear disparities in vaccination rates. This was a problem because, as countless epidemiologists were quick to point out, any strategy to contain the pandemic depended on inoculating everyone. If any significant human population were to remain unvaccinated, they could be infected by the virus, and with more infections, the virus would mutate further and then spread back to the rich countries. It was a situation wherein humanity needed a unified strategy against the plague. It was in this context that in October of 2020, South Africa and India made a proposal to waive several sections of the Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, or TRIPS. TRIPS, an international agreement which entered force in 1995 with the founding of the World Trade Organization, extends patent protections for 20 years to virtually every country across the globe for every major industry, including medicine. While technically any country can issue compulsory licenses to produce these drugs in the case of a national emergency, in practice, any country who actually does so risks retaliation by global pharmaceutical companies and the nations of the global north. In fact, South Africa had faced retaliation in the past for manufacturing generic drugs to treat HIV/AIDS. The US Trade Representative had even placed South Africa on the Special 301 watch list, which targets countries who violate the intellectual property rights of US enterprises. From there, the USTR levied punitive tariffs, harming South Africa's economy. Now in 2020, this request for a waiver represented the nations of the Global South humbly asking the North to allow it to manufacture much-needed life-saving medicine. The answer was no. The proposal was deadlocked for almost 2 years, undergoing a substantial watering down. The agreement that was finally reached in July 2022 was silent on India's and South Africa's requests to exempt all vaccines, treatments, and diagnostics related to COVID. According to Max Lawson, the head of inequality policy at Oxfam, this is absolutely not the broad intellectual property waiver the world desperately needs to ensure access to vaccines and treatments for everyone everywhere. The EU, UK, United States, and Switzerland blocked that text. This so-called compromise largely reiterates developing countries' existing rights to override patents in certain circumstances, and it tries to restrict even that limited right to countries which do not already have the capacity to produce COVID-19 vaccines. Meanwhile, as the North bogged down the South in TRIPS Council negotiations, the world was devastated by the pandemic. The widespread infection in India and South Africa produced the Delta and Omicron variants respectively. These highly infectious variants then spread to the global north, intensifying the pandemic there, just as had been predicted. All the while, hundreds of millions of vaccines in the stockpiles procured by the global north began to expire. In the end, tens of millions of people would die as a result of the pandemic and the inadequate response against it. At this point, we might ask ourselves, is this not a situation where everybody loses? The South dies for lack of medicine, which rots away unused in northern warehouses. The North dies from variants that evolve in the South specifically because they lack that medicine. The only people who benefit from this situation are the very selective group of people who own the rights to life-saving medicine as intellectual property. How can we permit this? If you were to ask a spokesperson from Pfizer or Moderna, they would tell us lovely stories about the inherent rights of inventors and how without IP laws, innovations like mRNA vaccines would not exist. But this ignores the fact that all of these companies received massive infusions of money from various northern governments to fund their research. We can summarize the situation like this. Monopolies on brilliant scientific ideas have been granted to a small group of unworthy beneficiaries. They have been made the owners of human knowledge, despite not producing it for themselves. From the standpoint of human welfare, there is no rational reason why this should be the case. But why are things this way? How did we get to where we are? It's an interesting question, isn't it? That's why this video is only the first in a series that will explore how we got to where we are. In attempting to form an answer, we will need to investigate over 400 years of history, starting with the origins of patent law in medieval Europe, moving into an exploration of how the massive gap in technology between the North and South was created, and connecting that history to the current day, what we will find is that technological advancement is always intertwined with power and economic interest, and that from the beginning, these powerful interests have tried to present their privileges over technology as moral necessities. I'm very excited to share more with you, so if you would like to learn more about this topic, which is an essential part of the story of empire, please make sure to subscribe to my channel. And if you would like earlier access to my videos, please subscribe to my Patreon. I look forward to speaking to you all again very soon.